now na itahala me kalehua. E halalehua no ia nakano e kauno ia e ano I nei e ali anei ho'i o Tahiti mai a ki mai no lua a hiti puno me ke aloha aloha e, aloha e, aloha e. Good afternoon, everyone. Aloha. Let's see. Still avakea? Close to that. My name is Jonathan Osorio. I am the moderator for this series. I'm really pleased to have everyone here. This panel is a panel that attempts to look at, to trace the genealogy of American aggression across the continent, from one ocean to the next, and to look at the ways in which our people resisted this aggression, but also to understand the differing forms of that aggression, how over and over again it is played out through military force and power, how over and over again it reflects a mounting violence, a violence that's learned and practiced and refined, and also a violence that comes at some point to look less like words that we use so comfortably, like conquest and warfare, and more like murder. So with that as an introduction, I would like to introduce our really esteemed panelists. I'm going to introduce them in the order in which, well, actually in the order they'll be speaking. So begin with an old friend and ally, Kēhaulani Kauanui. She's a PhD and activist scholar and radio producer who has been teaching at Wesleyan University. She has a new role now, and she can talk about that. Is the author of Hawaiian Blood, Colonialism and Politics of Sovereignty and Indigeneity. Also the author of Paradoxes of Hawaiian Sovereignty, Land, Sex, and the Colonial Politics of State Nationalism. She's spoken here on this campus and in Hawaii on different islands on many occasions. The next speaker would be, actually, Julian Aguon. He is the founder of Blue Ocean Law, an international law firm that works at the intersection of human rights and environmental justice. Julian is also a Pulitzer Prize finalist and the author of No Country for 8-Spot Butterflies. Dean Saranillio is my daughter Haoli's favorite professor. He is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Hawaii at Manoa and author of Unsustainable Empire, Alternative Histories of Hawaii Statehood. And Vernadette Gonzalez. We knew her as the director of the honors program here and a long-time supporter of indigenous indigenous studies and ethnic studies. She is now a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Berkeley, author of Securing Paradise and Empire's Mistress, and co-editor of Detours and Bangtan Remixed. I'm not going to spend any more time. I'm just going to ask Kēhau to begin. Mahalo.
Okay, mahalo nui loa for that introduction and for the beautiful Oli. Aloha ka. Valina, can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this gathering and to speak on this panel with individuals I so admire. Kumujan asked me to address specifically the connections between 1898 and earlier US expansion across North America. In my brief time today, I want to address US imperialism and the federal government's dispossession of tribal nations through settler colonialism, both through the state as well as through settlers themselves, even prior to state action attaching themselves. Because I understand that the conference has a mixed audience, including relatively young undergrads, I wanted to define some of my terms. And many of these will be familiar to some of you, hopefully most of you. Imperialism is a policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. Colonialism in general is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another people's land, occupying it with settlers, and typically exploiting it economically. There are different kinds of colonialisms: internal colonialism, mandate colonialism, neo-colonialism, franchise colonialism, and so forth. Unfortunately, there are lots of forms. Settler colonialism, and this is in terms of the definition that I'm using, is a land-centered project that depends on the elimination of indigenous peoples in order to replace them with a settler population. As Kēhaulani K. Trask put it, the goal of settler colonialism is, quote, the obliteration rather than the incorporation of indigenous peoples, end quote. An obvious example is the Israeli settler colonial genocide targeting Palestinians that is live streaming right now and has been ongoing long prior to October 7th. In combination with Trask's work, as well as that of Fayez Segeh, Palestinian who theorized settler colonialism in Palestine, I find Patrick Wolf's theory of settler colonialism useful in understanding indigenous elimination as ongoing, and also because his work speaks across multiple geographies. As he put it, quote, settler colonizers come to stay. Invasion is a structure, not an event, end quote. His phrase then captures the idea and the acknowledgement that settler colonial invasion of indigenous lands should not be understood as merely one distinct event of the past, but rather is continuously reproduced, that indigenous peoples are continuously subject to genocidal forms of subjugation. Wolf asserted that settler colonialism is an ongoing structure. However, he did not say that settler colonialism is permanent, not at all. His point was that it takes the dismantling of those structures to end settler colonial domination, not mere regime change. In other words, it takes more than deoccupation to restructure any society built on settler colonialism. Wolf argued that although settler colonialism destroys to replace, as he put it, it is not simply a form of genocide, since there are cases of genocide without settler colonialism. We can think here of the Nazi Holocaust, Rwanda, Darfur, Cambodia, for example. And so he said it's not simply a form of genocide for that reason, but also because elimination refers to more than mass killing. He offered then the concept of structural genocide to enable an understanding of the relationships between outright genocide and forced removals of indigenous peoples from their land and coercive forms of what he called biocultural assimilation. In Hawaii, we can see this in the blood quantum policy that the federal government and state used to define Kanaka Maoli with the 50% rule, that is writing Kanaka Maoli out of existence, and the assimilation policies throughout most of the 1900s to eliminate the native as native, as well as, say, the forces of economic strangulation that compel our people to relocate from the islands to the continent, that is coercive forms of outmigration. In Wolf's theory then, even though none of those examples are cases of outright genocide, since they are not examples of mass killing, he would contend that they are forms of elimination and therefore they are genocidal. And so here I want to briefly connect US imperialism with US settler colonialism. As most of you will know, following the settlers' victory, the English settlers' victory in the Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783, the newly formed USA continued to expand across North America. So part of what would be understanding here is the original 13 colonies along the eastern seaboard that become the newly formed states through the Articles of Confederation end up creating a boundary between those eastern seaboard states. And what we would be looking at here is an ever-shifting boundary that moves west. But prior to that, I want to just highlight that the very first US treaty with any Indian tribe was ratified in 1778, right? So right when the US is formed, and that's with the Lenape people, also known as the Delaware tribe. First treaty signed, first treaty broken. Treaties, importantly, were the primary instrument for political relations between the US government and Indian nations, and those were brokered between 1789 and 1871. The US stopped treating with Indians at that time after the Civil War, and I'm happy to speak to that in the Q&A if there's time and interest. So importantly, this is a form of recognizing mutual sovereignty. However, there's a contradiction because by US law and by international law, treaties can only be brokered between equals. And so it's in the very instance that the US brokers treaties with tribal nations that it both recognizes their sovereignty as inherent, but all US treaties brokered with tribes were treaties of cession. So it also becomes a way to actually extract something from them. And then in federal policy, there's a major contradiction because Indian tribes as tribal nations, although they are federally recognized as distinct polities, are understood to be and treated as domestic and dependent, that is, as lesser sovereigns. So what I want to zone in on here is that the ways in which treaties were used as a tool to expropriate land from tribes. And expropriate here means to take land from tribes. As such, they are known as treaties of cession. Note that word cession. An act of cession in legal terms is an act of surrender, a giving up, a relinquishment of control. I'll come back to that term in the context of Hawaii towards my conclusion. What I want to turn to here is that the US expansion across the continent throughout the 1800s was fortified by the American belief in manifest destiny. This is the understanding that American settlers were destined by divine right to expand westward across North America to the Pacific Ocean and beyond. In other words, these white Protestants asserted that they had a God-given right to native lands. And as I mentioned earlier, they constructed a frontier, or the idea of the imaginary of a frontier as a bounded part that continuously moves. So what was once the boundary on the other side of the original 13 states that were established after the American Revolution became a line that kept shifting from the Mississippi River further west. And without rehearsing all of the ways in which the US nation state expanded for a land grab, I just want to highlight some of the very obvious ones: the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, the acquisition of Oregon Country in 1829, which gave the US access to the Pacific Ocean, annexation of the Republic of Texas, which led directly to the Mexican-American War. And through that war of aggression, the US acquired more than half of Mexico's territory, including what became California. You have the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 and so on. But also note that in that period of the early 19th century, the US government passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president, and in this case, President Jackson, to grant lands west of the Mississippi to settlers in exchange for Indian lands within existing borders. This impacted those living east of the Mississippi, primarily in the states of Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, and others. When tribes resisted, the US relied on treaty fraud and military force. One of the many outcomes of the Removal Act was the Trail of Tears. The US Army forcibly removed over 100,000 American Indians from what is now the southeastern US to what was then called Indian Territory and later became the state of Oklahoma. And that's notably the five so-called civilized tribes. They tend to refer to themselves as the five tribes. That's the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Muskogee, also known as the Creeks, and the Seminole. This ethnic cleansing of indigenous peoples from east of the Mississippi River is an example of settler colonial elimination, genocidal ethnic cleansing. But indigenous peoples did not give up their lands without a fight and still do not give up their lands without a fight. the federal government and white American settlers who went rogue, right, engaged in genocidal wars against numerous tribal nations known as the Indian Wars. These include the 19th century wars, that's sort of a group of smaller massacres, the Seminole Wars, Sand Creek Massacre, Battle of Little Bighorn, and the massacre at Wounded Knee. Most historians will suggest that the Wounded Knee Massacre of 1890 is the last of the Indian Wars, but even the US government counts the last two official US Indian Wars in the early 20th century. That's the Massacre of the Shoshone Indians in 1911 and the Battle of Bear Valley in 1918. So the point here that I want to draw is that you have historians at the time, including governmental sort of spokespeople, talking about this as the closing of the frontier. And yet, if we look beyond the Western coastline, we see that that's a farce. And here I want to call attention to Richard Drinnan's 1997 book titled Facing West, The Metaphysics of Indian Hating and Empire Building. I first learned about that text from Haunani K. Trask when I was an undergraduate and had an ongoing correspondence with her. Drinnan argues that American expansion is characterized by repression and racism, and he reinterprets the winning of the West, tracing colonialism from the Pequot War in Connecticut, about an hour from where I am right now, in the 1630s, by the British, through American expansion westward to the Pacific and beyond to the Philippines and Vietnam. I also want to call attention to Dakota scholar Elizabeth Cook Lynn's 2007 book called New Indians, Old Wars. And in that, she argues that Indian wars of resistance must be centered in understanding the US war on terror, the so-called war on terror that has been ongoing since 9/11. And then there is Stefan Aun's brand new book that just was released this year titled Indian Wars Everywhere, Colonial Violence and the Shadow Doctrines of Empire. In that, he shows how contemporary references to the Indian Wars seep through not just American military history, but current day US wars of aggression that invoke the conquest of Native peoples as a success that can be used as a blueprint for modern warfare. And here's where that word that Kumujan brought up comes in, right? Where American officials will talk about the conquest of tribes. And yet that's also a contradiction. You can't both recognize the sovereignty of an indigenous polity or any other polity if you've conquered them. Conquering can't be held at the same time that you recognize sovereignty. So anytime somebody says conquered, they're essentially saying that you are no longer recognized as a sovereign. The point here, and we can see this with the US sponsored genocide in Palestine, right, is that idea of a US war of aggression and invoking language of the soon to be defeated or conquered Native peoples. In other words, the Indian Wars never ended. And that was also something I want to highlight that was spoken loud and clear during the No DAPL struggle, trying to protect Lakota lands from the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? So back in 2016, you had North Dakota law enforcement officers firing water cannons, tear gas, and other less than lethal weapons on unarmed water protesters and water protectors against the Dakota Access Pipeline in below freezing weather. And you heard protectors saying over and over again to any media that would listen, the Indian Wars have never ended. And that was an example of that. So this is an example of ongoing settler colonial domination. And you know, people around here, when I talk about ongoing settler colonial domination, for example, they'll say, how can that be when the Mashantucket Pequot, an hour away, have a casino? Well, that's because the US is open to tribes exercising commerce as long as it's in the realm of business that the federal government approves of. So for me, the marker isn't whether or not somebody's got a casino. The marker, the index is whether or not they have their land back and whether or not they're subject to US plenary power. US plenary power is absolute authority that the US federal government exercises over tribal polities, just as it exercises plenary power over the unincorporated territories of both the Pacific and the Caribbean. So just like there's ongoing settler colonial domination, there's ongoing resistance. And what I want to, as I'm segueing here towards the end of this, because we've been asked to keep our talks really short so that we can have some cross discussion before opening it up to Q&A, I want to and because the title of the panel is on resistance, and yet I was asked to do some more of the historical background, I want to underscore here that because settler colonialism is a land-centered political project that relies on the logic of elimination, as well as the practices and policies of elimination of the native, a la Trask, Saye, and Wolf, that means that decolonization must entail a refusal of that logic, along with the refusal of the practices and policies that carry out that elimination. That also means the indigenous reclamation of ancestral lands through return, reclamation, and restitution. And here I want to end by highlighting the Land Back movement, which centers on the return of land to the stewardship of indigenous peoples. This is a movement sweeping across all of North America, and it goes beyond, importantly, beyond land transfer in an expansive way that addresses many aspects of dispossession that stem from land dispossession, that is, respecting indigenous rights as polities, preserving languages and customary practices and traditions, ensuring food sovereignty, housing, and clean air and water. As I wrap up here, I want to circle back around to that word cession I noted at the beginning of my talk. In Hawaiʻi, the term is used to refer to the so-called public lands, which state agents often refer to as ceded lands, right? So ceded is tied to the idea of cession. And yet we know that those lands, all 1.8 million acres, are the national lands of the Hawaiian Kingdom. The US federal government acknowledged them as stolen lands in the 1993 Apology Resolution, in which the US Congress apologized for the illegal overthrow of the monarchy. It also clearly states, quote, the indigenous Hawaiian people never directly relinquished their claims to their inherent sovereignty as a people or over their national lands to the United States, either through their monarchy or through a plebiscite or referendum, end quote. There is no treaty of cession between the Hawaiian nation and the US. The US had treaties with the kingdom, but none were treaties of cession. Instead, there were treaties of friendship, commerce, and navigation, as well as economic reciprocity and extradition. So like I like to tell my students, not a penny or a puka shell was ever exchanged for even an inch of our lands. Hashtag land back. And I don't want to suggest, though, that just because tribes had treaties of cessions with the federal government, that land dispossession is acceptable, right? We know, again, that treaties themselves were instruments of land dispossession, and also that even with abiding by tribes, there are tribes that haven't had their treaties honored even to access important lands. And so as I wrap up, I just want to highlight the work of the Indian Collective, NDN Collective, which also has Hawaiian partners. And I can say more about my understanding of that in the Q&A. Some of those partners might be in the room there. But for example, you think about the Lakota and the treaty, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 promised the Black Hills to the Lakota people. And that treaty has been violated. And there is a huge battle over all of the Black Hills, but especially with Mount Rushmore being right there at the center. And so that's an example of a treaty violation. And so, you know, there are different tribes using different kinds of strategies and tactics to leverage land back. And there are a number of examples of that I'd be happy to speak to. Going on in the US context, I'm teaching a senior seminar here at Wesleyan right now called Land Back. And my students are engaged in case study research on different land back. And even if this is new to you outside of the context of Hawaiʻi, I would encourage you to GTS, Google that, and plug in California Land Back 2024, and you'll see already nearly a dozen cases just in this year alone. And it's happening through a number of different means. And I'd be happy to say more about that in terms of my understanding and also connecting that work to what's going on there in Hawaii Aku. Mahalo.
Amazing.
Good, okay. We'll be joined by Julian Aguon.
Hello, everybody. Hafa day and greetings from Guam. Can you all hear me all right?
Yeah. Very well.
Okay, I didn't prepare remarks. I have a bunch of chicken scratch here. filled with bullet points of things I want to say. But basically, I'll try to keep it relatively short, but I agree with what Kēhaulani just said. And basically, I kind of want to echo that and actually explain a little bit more about that particular moment in history, because of course this is called the 1898 project, but that year is so legally significant because everything that Kēhaulani just talked about was sort of the wide range of legal fictions that were alive and well even before the turn of the century. And so one of the fictions she was mentioning, although I don't know we're specifically using that name, is the legal fiction of the domestic dependent nation. This is essentially a lie, but what it really is just legal mischief, and it's a real salient moment in the history, in American history, that shows exactly what the U.S. will do using sort of lawfare or the use of law and legal process to delegitimize your opponent. It's essentially make-believe, and we see it at various moments in American history. And we saw it very clearly in 1898 and then 1899 and 1901 and 1902 with these turn of the century cases called the insular cases. Essentially, the insular cases, sort of the standard account of the cases is that they resolve the issue of whether the US Constitution followed the flag to those colonies annexed by the United States after the close of the Spanish-American War. It's said to resolve those issues, but what really happened was the introduction of an entirely new category of territory. Up until that point in this country, there had only been one kind of territory. And in this moment, the US, for racist and expansionist and other reasons, had decided, no, we're going to pretend now that there are two categories of territories. One, the incorporated territory, where the Constitution does automatically follow the flag and all of its sort of rights and privileges apply. And then there's this second fake category that never existed, but all of a sudden does in this moment in American history, and that is the unincorporated territory. So where the US Constitution doesn't apply of its own force, and it takes an affirmative action, a step on the part of Congress to choose, sort of like from a buffet, which portions of the US Constitution would apply in the sort of far-flung, Spanish colonies. So this is that sort of moment, and we have been trapped, logistically speaking and legally speaking, in that nightmare ever since. I mean, to be very clear, the reason why the US acts the way it does in all of these sort of areas that are still colonies and are still run as overseas colonial possessions is because this country has never sort of actually come to terms with that sort of conundrum. Just like a domestic dependent nation makes absolutely no sense, neither does the doctrine of territorial incorporation for which the insular cases stand. So it's this sort of constitutional nether zone. It's this sort of like playground where the federal government gets to sort of do what it wants to the territories or colonies without having to be sort of burdened by the cumbersome sort of provisions of the US Constitution. And this allows the federal government, in effect, to act in all kinds of ways that offend the US Constitution. I'll just give you one quote. It was recently in the papers here in Guam. And it said, this is the quote: "This is American soil in the midst of the Pacific. Guam is a US territory. This means we can do what we want here and make huge investments without fear of being thrown out." This was a quote that guided what's happening now in Guam in 2024. And that is the hyper-militarization of my entire island. Lands, our skies, our seas, everything. Guam is being militarized to in such an aggressive and sort of fast-paced sense. We are sort of bracing ourselves for what I have been calling a cataclysmic round of militarization. And why? Because it's the same logic. The US basically said, because of pressure with Japan, it had to sort of move a certain amount of troops out of Okinawa. And sort of that was the bargaining chip, or that was the sort of logic that why Guam was a better choice for all of these US Marines of dependence, because Guam is American soil, it's a territory, and they can act in ways that they cannot in other countries. So that is sort of where we are now. We are experiencing in the island of Guam a really sort of expansive US military project they have built. I want to now really quickly go and quickly explain the current landscape of Guam. And I'm going to use a personal example, just so you can understand what I'm talking about. It's not a theoretical exercise or an intellectual exercise. It's a bodily exercise. The other day, I'm in Tumon Bay, swimming with my nieces and nephews, surrounded by other local families, and B-52 bombers are just piercing the bright blue sky. They're just piercing the bright blue sky as if that's the most mundane thing in the world. That same day, I get home, I walk my dog in a quiet residential village of Jonia, and they're our fighter jets flying in formation, and they are so low. I almost think I'm having like heart palpitations because they are so loud and they're screeching over all of these quiet village streets. And that happened 4 times that week. I tried to take a Zoom call from home, and the fighter jets were flying so low that the glass of water on my home office desk was vibrating. You know, I could see ripples in the water. That is what it means to live in Guam in 2024. It is to know with your very bones that the specter of war is not coming. It is here. And as I won't go into too much detail about why the geopolitics, we sort of all understand that the US, among sort of the other things it's doing, it's also sort of trapped in this like sort of race with China in a way that where both parties are trying to amplify their sort of influence and power in this geopolitical theater, which means very concrete things for us here in Guam and in the region. The last thing I want to like sort of get to, other than the sort of the overall sort of legal framework and how it's sort of still applying now and how we can't win any of these lawsuits that we've been filing. We won some. I'm sort of a lawyer, if you don't know, and we have filed a bunch of lawsuits. I feel like we're always suing the federal government every 5 minutes. We have sued the US military, Fish and Wildlife, NIMS, NOAA. I mean, it is like all day long here because this military project, the sort of, you know, the military industrial complex is so pervasive here that I would say it is our meat and drink. It is the very air that we breathe. It is that intense. And so what we are doing, what we are trying to do is use the law to try to arrest the sort of spreading canopy of US militarization. And I will just be very blunt for the sake of our time together. We have lost most of those cases and most of the cases that really mattered. Why? Because the system is broken. The system is broken. The very federal agencies on land and at sea that are tasked with protecting endangered species, such as the 26 species of marine mammals that are currently being endangered by the US military activities off the coast of Guam, and on land, the fish and wildlife, and the 23 that are also from the Marion ace-butt butterfly to the flying fox to, I mean, there's so many endangered species. And I mean 23 on land, 26 at sea, and all of them have been what? Authorized. Because these federal agencies that have been tasked statutorily with protecting these species are effectively granting the US military waivers. That is what I mean. It's like the system is so deeply broken that we can't even trust any of the agencies that have been tasked with sort of protecting any of us, including our other than human relatives, with doing their job. Because all we have now are letters of authorization. All we have are incidental take permits. If you read them, you will see that what I'm talking about is to the tune of tens of thousands marine mammals that are on the chopping block that have been authorized to be taken, whether that's full on killed or just harmed and otherwise harassed in their spaces. So that is what's happening on Guam. And the reason why I don't mean to be dramatic, but it is dramatic. And this is what's happening, and the enormity of it, the sheer scale of it it's mind-boggling, and all of it has been legally sanctioned. So it's just like I'll keep it, and then we can chit chat.
I'm going to move the.
Yeah, aloha mai kākou. I don't think this is on. Can everybody hear me? Okay, so I'm very honored to be here with all of you. And I'm so grateful to be speaking after both Julian and Kēhaulani, because I think a lot of what I'm going to say complements what they just did. And so I've been saying this a lot, but I've been thinking a lot about this kind of historical moment that we're living in, and thinking about this moment as just an era of disaster. And so, I don't need to name these things, but Lahaina fires, but it wasn't just Lahaina, right? The week before that, Kēhaulani was on fire. Kēhei was on fire, upcountry. At one point, the whole island felt like it was on fire, right? From Red Hill, from the pandemic, before the pandemic, the fires in Australia, typhoons in Guåhan, it just seems like we're living in this era of disaster. And they're no longer singular events, but a continuity of events, all with common origins in our global economic system, with capitalism. And so I'm going to think a little bit about the Northwest Ordinance and take us to 1787, which is what Kēhaulani was speaking about, but also what Julian was talking about. So the Northwest Ordinance is basically the moment where the United States designs a blueprint to settle the North American continent, right? So instead of having 13 colonies, 13 states travel westward and compete with each other for land, what they decide instead is to create territories, 5,000 free male inhabitants. After you have 5,000, you could establish a territory. Okay? After you have 60,000, then you could establish a state. Okay? So the process of the Northwest Ordinance was essentially a process of settler colonialism. Before they established the Northwest Ordinance, they invite two generals to Congress to help them figure out what they're going to do with Native Americans. So they invite General Philip Schuyler and they invite General George Washington. Good old George Washington. George Washington argues, and he's nicknamed by the Haudenosaunee as Town Destroyer. He argues that what they should do is establish a frontier line across the continent, and they should just murder Native peoples as they go. Philip Schuyler, another general, says that's just too expensive. We can't do that. It's too costly for white lives, right? In this racist idea for a white life to be lost as a result of an Indian killing them, that is not worth that exchange. What he says instead is to target the land by which Native peoples live, destroy their foodways, destroy their culture and their lifeways, and in that way they will freely choose to leave westward, okay? And so that is the origins of the United States, and it sets the stage for 1898. And just as Julian said, 1898 is another moment of legal mischief where they're making these distinctions between incorporated territories and unincorporated territories. A lot of the things that we are talking about in this, over these last 2 days, at one point was itself illegal, right? So in the Philippines in 1901, they passed the Sedition Act, which means if you challenge US sovereignty in the Philippines, you are committing the act of sedition, and you could be deported or imprisoned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about him a little later, but there are a lot of different Filipino revolutionaries for which this happened. And so when we think about economic development, there's a way that if you just understand these basic historical processes, you can understand that economic development is inherently anti-life. Not just anti-life as it relates to humans, but anti-life as it relates to non-humans, right? So in regards to the elimination of the buffalo, there were 15 million buffalo in 1871, and by 1903, there were only 34 that remained, okay? They were targeting the buffalo because, just as Kēhaulani mentioned, right, they couldn't militarily defeat the Lakota, right? That was their lands. When you look at the Badlands National Park, so-called quote-unquote national park, right, they were very aware of how to battle the US cavalry. So what Philip Sheridan, another general, Philip Sheridan did was he invented this strategy of targeting the buffalo. And that is how they made the Native peoples there vulnerable, okay? In Hawaii, it's very similar, right? But instead of targeting kalo specifically, they target the waterways. They extracted water, right? They took away the water and they expanded industrial sugar production, right, at the expense of all of the lo'i. On Maui, a man named Hakuole wrote from Kula saying that Nawaiʻeha, he could see the replacement of the kalo with sugar production, right? And he was concerned with what Native peoples were going to be able to eat. Will they still be able to eat poi, right? And they're saying this right around the same time as they're expropriating water from Lahaina. So these things are all running parallel with each other. And so when we think about capitalism, and I think this is something that Julian is saying, it is in the death of these human to non-human relationships that is the birth of capitalism, right? It is in the death of the buffalo. It is in the death of the kalo. It is in the death of these relationships, these familial relationships, that is the birth of capitalism. And this mode of production has evolved to set the conditions for environmental crisis globally, right? For climate crisis. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about thinking through the economy and the ways in which we kind of imagine the United States, especially at 1898. So sometimes we think of the United States as kind of expanding westward, seizing all of this land, becoming more and more powerful, and then sort of expanding into the Pacific as a result of strength. But I think that's a wrong read, because it was actually the US economy that was tanking that led them to expand into the Pacific, right? From 1873 into 1898, half of those years were spent in economic depression. The panic, or the Great Depression of 1873, they called it the Great Depression at that time, not until 1929, right? That is what animated the reciprocity treaties, right? That is what animated them seizing Pearl Harbor. And so if we read Dismembering Lahui, we understand that that was the conditions under which that led to the 1893 overthrow, right? So it is from this kind of understanding of the United States as being in an economic depression that animates 1898, okay? The Harrison administration develops an idea called depression diplomacy. And basically what he's saying is the United States has industrialized, they have a glut of industrial goods, so in other words, they don't have enough people to buy their goods. This is creating economic depressions. It's also creating labor unrest, right? Walter Grisham, the Secretary of State, said this is potentially a period of revolution because of the amount of labor unrest that was taking place in the United States, okay? And so what the Harrison administration does, which is when Thurston and them travel to DC, right, is they're open to annexation because they see Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines as stepping stones to markets in China, okay? So they're using this as a way of trying to get themselves out of economic depression. Fast forward, and that leads us into the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War is a misnomer. So when we think about 1898, we think about it between 1898, is it 1903 or 1902? That's the years of the Spanish-American War. The United States is at war with Spain for only, from April to August, right? What they actually mean is the Philippine-American War. That is what takes place up until 1902. I'm sure, I don't know if I'm stealing your thunder. I'm sure Bernadette is going to cover this. Yeah. And that was a genocidal war. So when I was going to school, I learned about the Philippine-American War. They say 100,000 Filipinos, right? That is already too many. But then as they do more and more research, they say it was actually more like 1 million, right? If you read Dylan Rodriguez's more recent book, Suspended Apocalypse, he says when you look at the numbers of what the soldiers describe, it was 2 million Filipinos who died. We weren't referred to as Filipinos at that time. Filipinos were those who were born in the Philippines but had Spanish ties. We were referred to as Indios, right? So it was that long legacy of Indian hating that led to the massacres in the Philippines. And the other thing that Dylan Rodriguez argues is that it's a misnomer to call it the Philippine-American War. He says it's more akin to a massacre, right? Okay, so in thinking through this politics of genocide that is targeting Native peoples, it also leads to a lot of solidarity. So the citizens of the Cherokee Nation, for instance, they write to Queen Liliuokalani asking, quote, how many volunteer Americans would it require to reestablish your majesty's government and displace the oligarchy that usurps your country, right? During the Philippine-American War, there's lots of instances of support. Noe Silva mentioned this yesterday, right? But I think Kim Kompak does research on this and gives a more complete story. But Emilio Aguinaldo is writing 2 letters. Sorry, it's the other way around. Robert Wilcox from Hawaii, right, leader of the Wilcox Rebellion, writes 2 letters in support of Aguinaldo's war against the Americans, right? He says, I would fight alongside with you if I could, right? Patricio Abinales makes the argument that half of the US generals in the Philippines were actually involved in the Plains Wars against Native Americans, right? That's really important to understand. But if you look at the work of Rene Ontal, who's Filipino-American, American quote unquote, Apolinario Mabini, who was a radical intellectual seeking the national liberation of the Philippines from Spain and then eventually the Americans. He eventually loses the use of his legs as a result of polio. He writes letters to black soldiers in the Philippines, right? And this is one letter that they wrote on placards that they dropped in the villages, hoping that black soldiers would pick up and read, okay? So he writes, to the colored American soldier, it is without honor that you shed your precious blood. Your masters have thrown you into the most iniquitous fight with double purpose, to make you the instrument of their ambition, and also your hard work will make the extinction of your race. Your friends, the Filipinos, give you this good warning. You must consider your situation and your history and take charge. The blood of Sam Holes proclaims vengeance. Sam Holes was a black sharecropper who in Georgia, 2 weeks prior to the dropping of these placards, had been lynched in Georgia. Okay? So Filipinos were aware of what was happening throughout the United States in regards to African Americans, and they were making moments of solidarity. The 24th Infantry Regiment, all-black regiment, who were sent to the Philippines, many of them end up defecting from the US military and fighting alongside Filipinos, right? So David Fagan perhaps is the most famous of these individuals who fought alongside Filipinos. That story informs my understanding of how to live in Hawaii. Black soldiers in the Philippines were sent to colonize the Philippines, right? My location here in Hawaii as a Filipino is to understand and remember that story and to fight and support Kamakawiwoʻole in their movement for liberation and struggle, which is a simultaneous movement against capitalism, which is a simultaneous movement that challenges climate crisis as we see it today. So this has a legacy within Filipino history in Hawaii. So the Vibora Luz Viminda in the 1920s organized their union, organized out of Maui. And then the 1924 strike. And Vibora Luz Viminda is Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So trying to create solidarity amongst Filipinos because the Ilocanos and the Visayas were always being pitted against each other. But Vibora, I don't know if you know the name. What is his? So Vibora is the Viper General. I can't remember his name. Yes, Ricarte. Thank you so much. Yes. And Vibora, so it's named after the general who fought the Americans. And so they viewed their labor protests as a continuation of an anti-imperialist struggle. And Choncho Jose has a novel about this general. I think that the title of that novel is called Vibora. But there's lots of these kinds of struggles, and I guess I wasn't actually thinking I was going to sing this song, but just to kind of, I don't know how to close. So my dad grew up in Wahiawa at the CPC camp, sandwiched between all of these military bases. And he remembers being a child singing this song about the Philippines. And excuse me for being a horrible singer. So he says, oh Philippines, long time fight, but no can win. You fight for me, I fight for you. You die for me, tough shit for you. Oh Philippines, long time fight, but no can win. That they were singing these kinds of like playground blues, that they were singing about that grief that we were talking about in an earlier session, that is how they remembered the Philippine-American War. But also the propaganda around the Philippine-American War was always, if you fight the Americans, you will die. If you resist, you will die. It's foolish to resist. It's comical to resist. Just be obedient. I feel like there's something in that story, but there's also a kind of loss. And it wasn't sung in a kind of way that was laughing. It was more melancholy. So I'll just end there and thank you.
Well, it really sucks for me that I'm going after all these people. So I too have chicken scratches, and I'm going to keep it short because I do want to engage this incredible room of people. I look around here and I feel like, wow, these are all the people who are creating life here, right? Who are fighting for life. So two things I think that have become clear over the last 24 hours or so, right? But obviously we've a lot of us have been working on this kind of work forever. Two things that imperialism attempts to wrest away from us. Land, that's right, land. Our genealogical connections to land, our sovereignty when it comes to being in relation with a land in ways that are not extractive or violent. And by land, I mean Aina, I mean water, I mean the beings in it, all of us. Our responsibility to steward the land and to have it in turn nurture us, the communities that we form on the land, right? So I feel like land is one of those things that has really sort of emerged as a touchstone over this conference so far. And I'm focusing on this because the theme of the panel said ongoing histories of resistance. So I'm kind of I'm pulling from Kēhaulani and Julian and Dean, right, with the histories that they've established of struggle, of imperialism, of colonization, of legal, of lawfare, you know, all the different forms in which land is wrested away from indigenous people, right? The other thing that imperialism attempts to wrest away from us is voice, right? Our ability to tell or even know our own histories and to pass them down. Our voice in governance structures, right? And how we come to decide for ourselves. How do we come to decide for ourselves as people? Our voice in accurate and representative narration of our lives and struggles. Our voice in singing. Our voice in singing. Our connections to each other, a language in which to dream the futures that we all deserve, right? I think in 17 years, the 17 years that I had the opportunity and privilege of living and learning in Hawaii, really come to, I think, know viscerally what I had known intellectually, right? Intellectually, you know certain things when you study empire. You just learn the kind of recitation of violence that carves out all our lives in the ways that empire does. But there's also something to the lived and experienced knowledge of being in community and in struggle with people here. In ways that, as a Filipina settler whose family first immigrated to upstate New York to the soundtrack of Thriller in 1984, and then, you know, Hawaii's been the longest place I've lived anywhere, right? So it's been like the home that was removed from me when my family had to leave the Philippines for economic reasons, right? So I think we have to kind of think about like the different ways in which we come to the places we come to and the different loyalties that we form and the journeys that we have. In this room was the room I started to take hula lessons as an adult with Kumu Snowbird Bento. And the first, I was so excited to take hula with Kumu Snowbird. She's amazing. The first hula that she taught us was Kula'iwi. Sorry. And she didn't teach us how to dance it right away. She taught us the deep history of what Kula'iwi means, right? The plain, the land, right? And the iwi, the bones, right? What does it mean to have that feeling of loyalty and connection to a place, right? The song ends with the line, and I'm sorry if I murder this. He Hawaii au mau amau, right? And it's a declaration, right? I am Hawaiian forever and ever. I'm not Hawaiian. I'm not going to say I'm Hawaiian in my heart because that's also problematic, right? But I don't think it's a declaration of identity, but of loyalty. It's a declaration of solidarity, right? Of the deliberate kind of positioning, right? Shoulder to shoulder that you're going to take with the people whose land you share. So, because this panel is supposed to be about ongoing issues of resistance, I want to echo what Kēhaulani said, right? Resistance means then land back. It means land back at just the bottom. That's like the base of it. Land back. It means voice back. This is nothing new, right? This building is here because people struggled for land back. People struggled for voice back and a chance to kind of define the kind of education that they wanted, right? Hawaiian studies is founded on these principles. Ethnic studies is founded on these principles. Our stories ourselves, right? It was also founded on anti-war, anti-imperialist struggle, right? So those two are absolutely connected, right? So as I started to think about, you know, how do we fight this incredible structure, right? It's overwhelming. What we've learned about today is overwhelming. How do we even throw our voices into the void, right, to make a difference? How do we throw our bodies into the void to make a difference? And I think it starts with story, right? It starts with a story. How might we tell our own story, where we are and where we want to be? Noinoi Silva the other day described a really beautiful dream, right, about where might we be in 100 years? What might we be thinking about and celebrating, and how might we be living life with each other in 100 years? Could we celebrate something other than imperialism in 100 years, right? And so, I wanted to kind of end with the kind of project I've been involved with in the last 5 or so years, right? Thinking about voice back and land back, and how do we kind of prioritize and raise that up as a particular kind of mode of struggle. In Hawaii, the kind of story that is echoed back to us who live here, right, is a story about tourism, about militarism, right, as being those things that are good for this place, right? There's a beneficial story to development, right? These are all stories that get cast in particular ways, right? It's about that theft of language, that theft of the ability to tell a different kind of story other than the myth that is handed to us. They generate a lot of stories about paradise, right, through the travel narrative and the guidebook. And so the kind of project I've been involved with in the last 5 years, and it's kind of growing because I think that there's a recognition that there's a need for us to kind of put together our own stories on our own terms, right? So the Detours Decolonial Guide to Hawaii was a result of that kind of struggle, as a result of the individual kinds of stories of people's struggle and people's working with the land. Around this room, I mean, like, I'm seeing like half my contributors in this room. It's kind of amazing. So it's a curation of stories about place that were alive, that are alive, that are in formation and are currently being struggled for, right? The next volumes in production, it's now become a series, right? So it's become a series that really takes into account how people are really hungry to tell the stories about their connection to land. And it's no surprise that many of the volumes, the next projects about place and people, are places that have been drawn into the deadly orbit of the US war machine, right? So the next volume that's coming out is on Palestine. The volume that's coming out after that is on Guåhan. We have Okinawa, the indigenous Bay Area, and Puerto Rico also in the works, right? So you can kind of, I don't know, I mean, I'm usually a real downer, right? I mean, if you've read my first book, it's really depressing. And so I feel like I needed to turn to look around me and see exactly the kind of cultures of life and insistence on life, right, that are being produced in around us, that we recognize and struggle with the voices alongside each other and amplify each other's voices. One of the things that's really sad to me, though, is that there's no volume yet on the Philippines. And so, if you know anybody who would like to take that on, let me know. So I think I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're going to ask our overseas guests to join us again for this conversation and discussion. I'm looking at the timing on this. I just want to make sure that we can go on for a bit, right? All right. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people here anyway, so it's not like you'll just be late for your next session. That's all. They can get late. I actually don't know that I really want to begin this conversation, except that I just came from an amazing session on settler colonialism that you were directing, that you were moderating, Dean. And one of the things that really struck me about that is how there was never any really conversation in that panel about ethnicity or ancestry. It was actually all of the conversations were geared to looking at how settlers live in a place like Hawaii and whether they are really entangled. And they're not the only ones who are entangled. Many of us Native people are entangled in that capitalist economy and deeply committed to it, entangled in the military through direct participation or through really making apologies for it because you have family in it, or the police, the kinds of things that actually prop up this system. And the extent to which we have been corrupted by this notion of white supremacy. And so, I think it might be something that if you guys wanted to take off on this, it strikes me, and especially because this issue of Gaza and Israel, and I am, from the very beginning, we were outraged at the notion that anyone could criticize Hawaiians for being opposed to somebody else's occupation. But let me be really clear about this. The issue of settler colonialism is not ethnicity or ancestry. It's actually how you behave. It's how you behave as others. And if you guys want to take off on this or just totally ignore it, you're perfectly entitled to do that.
May I ask you to just add or maybe finish what I'm hearing as a subtextual ellipses there? When you say it's not about ethnicity or race, what's the it?
The conflict that we have in our own places with others who live with us, right? Native people have with others who live with us. That's what I meant.
Mahalo. I think one of the things that I think about with your comment, and we actually had a bit of a conversation about this last month when I was in your office, because I was asking you what the data is for Kanaka Maoli faculty tenured or tenure track at UH, and you were making an allowance for people who teach at UH who are onboarding Hawaiian cultural values in really meaningful and ethical ways. And so I'm hearing resonances of that come through in your question. And to some extent, I agree with you in terms of the solution. And I feel like that's what I really heard come through in Dean and Vernadette's presentations, right? Is how to actually live ethically as a settler of color or an Asian settler in a native land in ways that are really compelling and beautiful and are in ethical relationality, radical relationality with not just Kanaka Maoli, but with the Aina and all the living entities in Kapai Aina o Hawaii. So I believe in that in terms of a futuristic way of thinking about what does it mean to live by Kanaka values or have Kanaka-centered projects that are inclusive. And that's our people. Our people are an inclusive people. We've always absorbed outsiders, many times to our own detriment historically. And that absorption of outsiders has been used against us because that's how we end up, besides massive population collapse, right, is there's no kind of cultural ban on outmarriage or reproduction with people who are not Kanaka Maoli. And then you end up with a racially mixed population and people say, oh, see, they're not really Hawaiian anymore. It's like, no, that's actually an index of our Hawaiianness in my book. But at the same time, I really want to slow down on the settler colonial piece of that, because settler colonialism as a political project that is about the taking. And it's not just about the land expropriation, it's about replacing the native. This is where Wolf is really helpful, right? That it's that logic of elimination and it's about replacement. And he always said it took more than settlers to make it settler colonial, because you have plenty of other places where there are settlers, but their aim is not to entirely replace the indigenous population. And so he wouldn't have counted South Africa as a settler colonial site by the definition he's using, because that replacement element is core to it. And that's why he talks about it destroys to replace. And I learned so much about some of this from another side, from Jean O'Brien, who's a colleague and friend, who's White Earth Ojibwe, in her book, Firsting and Lasting. And she talks about how settlers indigenize themselves or attempt to, and that itself is part of the replacement process. So that's the other thing, is that settler colonialism's target is the Kanaka. It can destroy a lot more than that, but the idea is that replacement, and that it is really specific to the native. That doesn't mean that other people don't experience colonialisms in different ways, but that replacement piece, it's like the sticker, no Hawaiians, no aloha. So I want to hold meaningful space for that, because I think there are many people who would be very happy to learn our language and learn our cultural practices and have us not in the picture. And I'm thinking about my ohana in Anahola, Hawaiian homelands, and all the gated communities that have come up along the eastern coastline of Kauai, and looking at my own first cousins who were born and raised on Kauai and grew up. We have 5 generations in Anahola Hawaiian homelands, and just looking at which first cousins have had to leave. They literally cannot survive on Kauai. And every time I go back, even if it's just a few months apart, it looks different every single time. And so I just kind of want to slow that a bit, but hold space for the spirit of that comment around the values part.
Thank you, Kēhau. Anyone else can talk on this, or we can actually take questions from the floor as well. Yes.
Yeah, I guess Julian, this is Catherine. We met once before, and I'm from Guam. and I'm trying to wrap my head and process some of this stuff. I got an email from a family member who said, oh, you're coming back for the 80th anniversary of Liberation, Liberation Day, which was liberation from the Japanese.
They were really cool. I mean, I remember interviewing somebody, and I heard stories from my parents and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles, but I interviewed a gentleman who said, oh, yes, the Japanese cut off the breast of a woman who didn't divulge where they were hiding the radio man, the Navy radio man in caves. And so the Liberation Day that I grew up with was, for me, bigger than 4th of July. I didn't get 4th of July. But, and I'm just thinking back of the history, under the Japanese, under the Spanish, and the Spanish did some horrible things too. They, they wiped out the Incas and the Aztecs, and so I sometimes wonder, okay, well, the Japanese, the Americans didn't kill us on Guam, but are they the lesser of the 3 or 4 evils? I mean, what would it be like if we were under China? So I'm just trying to process all of this, but to give the context of, Guam was under the Americans, we were under the Japanese, we were under the Spanish, so you've got these empires, basically. And so, I'm trying to reconcile some of this stuff. I mean, I talk about our language, and I know more Hawaiian words than I do Chamorro words at this point, because I've been here for 4 years. Hawaiian word a day, it's just incredible in my brain. And the only thing that I really know in Chamorro is the Hail Mary. I know how to pray, and I don't know a lot about football, but I know Hail Mary pass. That's how I so I'm just trying to, like I said, process some of this, and I'm in the media, so I cover a lot of different things, and I try and step back and look at both sides. And so I just throw that out, just as, like I said, I just got this email saying, are you going to come back for, Liberation Day? It's liberation from the Japanese, and things have changed now politically, right? The U.S. relations with the Philippines, and what's going on, in Pacific and China. So anyway, I just throw that out. And like I said, still trying to process and wrap my head around a lot of it. I don't know, do you want to say something, or do you want to add to this conversation?
Sure. I was just a little confused about the timing. I thought everyone was gonna get up and go at this point. I'm happy to talk more with you offline, but the gist is, I just that sort of framing of the issue always makes me especially sad, because it just suggests to me that we're still always locked in this kind of like mindset where we're just having to choose our, like, it reminds me of US presidential election, which is the lesser of two evils, like which is the least bad colonizer. But this is the real issue, like that we live in an era where decolonization has already sort of captured the whole international imagination. Colonialism is a crime, just like genocide is a crime, meaning like it is, so it's clear, that is the evil that has to be uprooted. So I feel like I never want to be in a conversation where I have to choose the best of the colonizers. And I just feel like it's not a radical enough imagination, the kind of thing that's going to get us into a future where we can actually operationalize our values. As Chamorro people, we are so much more than our colonizers. We are honestly, the thing I'm proudest about to be Chamorro, and I still feel very much in in the community. The thing I'm most proud about is that reciprocity is our highest our quintessential cultural value. We, in fact, have more words for reciprocity than any other word in our language. That is a fucking clue to who we are as a people. Language contains information, and I think what's been so bruised and battered over time, over history, is that law of reciprocity has been violated by both parties, including by the party that gave too much. We can't keep giving. This is a problem, and we need to I'm trying to, as a writer, more so as a writer than as a lawyer, I'm trying to write in such a way that I can try to convince our people that the time has come for a new imagination, one in which we are not always entrenched in a purely subordinate role.
Thank you, Julian. Listen, everyone, please give a big hand to the panel. I've been asked to bring this to a close so people can get on to the next one. Thank you very much for being here.